On a stormy night, 11-year-old Maya braved the fierce winds and rain to search for her missing brother, Elijah. Everyone else was sheltering from the storm, but Maya couldn't bear the thought of him being out there alone. Against all odds, she ventured through flooded streets, slipped through the dark woods, and faced her deepest fears, all to bring her brother back home safely. Yet, what began as a desperate rescue turned into something even greater. By the time the sun rose, Maya's courage had sparked a transformation across her entire community, uniting neighbors, friends, and strangers in a newfound spirit of resilience and kindness. Inspired by her bravery, the town came together, rebuilding bonds and forming the Unity Project, a group dedicated to supporting one another through life's challenges. What started as one girl's quest to find her brother became a story that inspired, what would you do to protect the ones you love? Follow Maya's powerful journey through courage and compassion and discover how a single act can unite an entire community. The storm had been announced days before, but no one took it seriously. The weather reports warned of heavy rain, even potential flooding, but everyone in the neighborhood knew these warnings often came to nothing. Kids played in the streets as clouds gathered above, and families went about their routines, only half watching the sky. Maya leaned against the window, feeling uneasy as she watched the dark clouds churn above. She was only 11, but there was something about tonight that felt different. The sky was a strange, heavy grey, the type that pressed down on you, making you want to hide. Her mother called her away from the window to finish setting up for dinner, and Maya reluctantly pulled herself from the darkening view outside. As they settled down to eat, Maya's older brother, Elijah, strolled in, his jacket slung over one shoulder, and announced he was going to Marcus's house. "Just for a bit," he promised. Maya caught her mother's eye, waiting for her to say no, but instead she just sighed. "Fine, Elijah, but be back in an hour. They say the storm will start around 8. Yeah, I know," Elijah replied with a grin, ruffling Maya's hair as he passed by. "I'll see you guys in an hour, tops." And with that, he was out the door, disappearing into the misty evening. An hour passed, then 2, and the first crack of thunder shattered the air. Maya looked at the clock anxiously, the familiar sense of unease now knotting into full-on worry. Outside, rain began falling in thick sheets, drumming against the roof with a relentless fury that made her heart pound faster. Maya watched as the street filled with water, the puddles widening and merging into small rivers that licked at the curbs. "Mum, Elijah hasn't come back," she whispered, a tremor in her voice. Her mother was at the sink, washing dishes, but she paused, glancing out the window, a worried line deepening on her forehead. "He'll come back," her mother murmured, more to herself than to Maya. But her voice lacked conviction. A few minutes later, she checked her phone, scrolling through contacts, frustration flickering in her eyes. "The phone lines are acting up," she said, slapping the phone down on the table. "He probably just stayed over at Marcus's to ride out the storm." But Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Elijah would have called. He never just disappeared. She pictured him walking in the rain, slipping through muddy puddles, alone in the dark, and the thought made her chest tighten. Then, almost without realizing it, Maya was heading to the closet to pull out her raincoat and her flashlight. She barely heard her mother's voice calling her back, warning her to stay inside, to wait until the storm had passed. But Maya couldn't wait. She wouldn't wait. The rain was cold and fierce as she stepped out, immediately soaking through her shoes and plastering her hair to her face. She squinted against the downpour, clutching her flashlight tightly, its beam cutting a small slice of light through the sheets of rain. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the street, making the raindrops look like shards of glass falling all around her. The street, usually so full of life and laughter, felt eerily empty now. Doors and windows were shut tight, and every house looked like a dark, unwelcoming fortress. Even the streetlights seemed dim, their light drowned out by the relentless storm. Maya's steps were slow at first, cautious, but as she ventured further, her fear began to fade, replaced by a determination that felt larger than she was. She stopped by Mr. Samuel's house first, hoping for any sign of Elijah. Mr. Samuel, an elderly man with a quick, kind smile, was often Elijah's confidant. He might know something. She banged on the door, and after a moment it creaked open. Mr. Samuel appeared, his face a mix of surprise and worry. "Child, what are you doing?"
"Out in this storm?" he exclaimed, reaching out to pull her inside. But Maya shook her head, water flying from her curls. "Mr. Samuel, have you seen Elijah?" she asked, her voice urgent, barely holding back a quiver. "Your brother?" No, last I saw he was heading toward Marcus's house. You should be home, girl. It's no night for a child to be out alone." Maya's face fell, but she squared her shoulders, determined. "I'm going to find him. I can't just sit and wait," she said. And before Mr. Samuel could protest, she was already turning, her feet splashing in the growing puddles as she continued down the street. The rain intensified as she walked, slanting sideways, pelting her like icy needles. Her flashlight flickered, barely able to cut through the thick veil of rain. For a moment, doubt crept in. She was just a little girl. She could hardly see 2 feet in front of her, and the storm felt monstrous, swallowing her in its cold, merciless grip. But she pushed on. With each step, she thought of Elijah, of his laugh, his teasing grin, the way he always saved her the last cookie. Her brother was out there, somewhere, and she would find him. The rain blurred Maya's vision, but she kept going, her eyes scanning every shadow, every flicker of movement as she pushed forward. She called Elijah's name, her voice barely carrying through the roar of thunder, but she didn't stop. The storm was raging stronger now, lightning flashing above, illuminating the street in ghostly shades of grey. It seemed as if the world itself was testing her resolve, each gust of wind pushing her backward, each puddle trying to swallow her feet whole. Ahead, she spotted her next stop, Mrs. Ruby's small house, nestled at the corner. Mrs. Ruby was known for her nosiness, always keeping a careful watch over the neighborhood, always the first to notice who was coming and going. If anyone had seen Elijah that night, it would be her. Maya climbed the steps to Mrs. Ruby's door, knocking hard, hoping against hope that she would have news. After a tense moment, the door opened a crack, and Mrs. Ruby's wrinkled face peered out, her sharp eyes squinting through the rain. "Good heavens, Maya, what are you doing out in this weather?" she demanded, tugging the door open a bit wider. "Elijah, he hasn't come back home. I think he got stuck in the storm," Maya said, her voice trembling as she fought to keep her composure. She didn't want to cry. Not here. Not now. Mrs. Ruby's face softened, and she pulled Maya under the porch to shield her from the rain. "Sweetheart, he's probably just over at Marcus's, waiting for this mess to pass." "Your mother know you're out here?" Maya hesitated, shaking her head. "She told me to wait, but I can't, Mrs. Ruby. I know something's wrong." She looked up at the older woman, her eyes wide and pleading. "Please, did you see him pass by?" Mrs. Ruby's mouth twisted as she considered, then nodded. "I think I did. About an hour ago, he was walking down the street in that direction." She pointed down the darkened road that led to the edge of the woods. "I saw him duck down by the big oak tree. Looked like he was in a hurry, but with this storm, maybe he just found shelter somewhere." Maya nodded, though the answer was far from reassuring. She had hoped for something more, anything to suggest Elijah was safe and sound. But if he'd headed toward the woods, he could be anywhere by now. The woods were dangerous on a good day, let alone in the middle of a storm. Maya, Mrs. Ruby said, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. Don't do anything reckless. The storm's only getting worse. You should go back home. But Maya barely heard her. Thank you, Mrs. Ruby, she said quickly, breaking away from the porch, her flashlight bobbing as she hurried off toward the woods. Mrs. Ruby's protests faded behind her, lost in the roar of the storm. She knew she was heading toward one of the riskiest parts of town, but her brother needed her. Elijah had always been the one to look out for her ever since their dad had passed away. He was her protector, her best friend, and now it was her turn to be there for him. The streetlights grew sparse as she neared the woods, casting long, twisted shadows across the flooded ground. Maya's heart pounded, but she forced herself to keep moving, the cold rain seeping into her clothes, chilling her to the bone. As she entered the thick trees, she felt a rush of dread, the canopy above blocking out what little light the street lamps provided. She kept her flashlight steady, following the muddy trail, her boots slipping in the thick mud. "Elijah!" she shouted, her voice swallowed by the wind. Her words felt small and weak, barely making it past the towering trees and rustling leaves. The woods had always been a place of mystery and fear, a place she and Elijah would dare each other to explore in the summer. But now it felt alive with hidden dangers, each crackling branch and shifting shadow making her
heart race faster. She pushed forward, slipping and scrambling over roots and rocks, the flashlight flickering ominously in her hand. Every step took more effort as the storm hammered down on her, the relentless wind making it harder to see, harder to move. But then, just as her hope began to waver, she saw something, a faint glimmer of light through the trees. Her pulse quickened as she stepped closer, hoping it was him. As she neared, she realized it wasn't Elijah, but a small campfire under a makeshift tarp. Sitting by the fire was a man wrapped in layers of ragged clothing. He looked up, startled, as Maya approached, his eyes widening with surprise. "Well now," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "What's a little girl doing out here in a storm like this?" Maya swallowed her fear, gripping the flashlight tighter. "I'm looking for my brother. His name is Elijah. He's 17. Have you seen him?" The man studied her, his expression softening. "Can't say I have. But the woods aren't safe tonight, child. You'd best go back home before you get lost yourself." "I can't," she replied, shaking her head. "I have to find him." The man's gaze lingered on her, a glint of understanding in his eyes. "You're brave, I'll give you that," he said, gesturing to the fire. "Take a minute to warm up at least. You won't do him much good if you freeze out here." Reluctantly, Maya edged closer to the fire, feeling the warmth seep into her chilled skin. She could see now that the man was older, his face lined with years of hardship, his hands rough and calloused. He watched her closely, a strange mixture of worry and respect in his eyes. "You're like my sister was," he said after a moment, his voice quiet. "Didn't let nothing stop her, not even a storm." Maya looked up at him, her fear easing just a bit. "What happened to her?" "She always did what she had to," he replied, a faint smile crossing his face. "Taught me to do the same." He handed her a small blanket from his pile of belongings. "Here, keep this. The storm's mean tonight. Your brother's lucky to have you looking for him." She accepted the blanket, her resolve strengthening as she wrapped it around her shoulders. "Thank you," she murmured, feeling a surge of courage. "Good luck, little one," he said, tipping his hat as she stepped away from the fire. "I hope you find him." Maya left the warmth of the fire behind, venturing further into the woods, her heart steady, her steps sure. She was alone, drenched and exhausted, but she was not giving up. Elijah was out there, and no storm, no shadow would stop her from finding him. Maya pressed onward, clutching the flashlight in one hand and gripping the blanket close around her shoulders with the other. The warmth of the fire faded with each step she took, and soon the night closed in around her again. She could barely see the path ahead, her flashlight barely cutting through the dense, rain-laden branches. But each time she wavered, each time the storm felt too big and she felt too small, she would remember Elijah's smile, or the way he always seemed to know what to say to make her laugh. She wouldn't stop until she found him. The rain pelted her face, stinging as it struck her cheeks, but she ignored it, forging ahead with a new determination. The storm seemed to grow angrier, as if challenging her every step. Thunder cracked above, rumbling through the trees, and the wind whipped around her, sending branches creaking and groaning in eerie tones. She couldn't help but think how these woods had felt so different during the day. She and Elijah used to joke that it was like a friendly giant during the day, a place of grand trees and soft sunlight. Now it felt like that giant had turned against her. Pushing aside the thought, Maya kept her eyes trained on the path. Her feet were sinking deeper into the mud, and with each step her boots felt heavier, making it harder to pull her feet free. But just when the path seemed to narrow into darkness, she saw a faint, muddy footprint. Her heart leapt. She leaned in, squinting in the dim light. The footprint was large, much bigger than her own, and half filled with water from the rain. But she was certain it was Elijah's. No one else would be out here at this time. "Elijah!" she called, her voice cracking with hope and desperation. Only the rain replied, hammering down in cold, relentless sheets. She scanned the ground for another print, moving the flashlight in a slow arc across the muddy path. And there it was, a second print, slightly farther off to the side. It was partially obscured by leaves and branches, but she could see it. He had definitely come this way. Encouraged, Maya quickened her pace, following the faint trail. The deeper she went, the more the sounds of the town faded, replaced by the raw, untamed noise of the storm and the woods. She felt isolated, almost as if she were in a different world, a place where people didn't belong, especially not little girls searching for their lost brothers. She stumbled over a thick root that jutted out across the trail, catching herself just before she fell. Her flashlight slipped from her hand, landing with a dull thud in the mud. She quickly picked it up, brushing away the dirt and mud, and flicked it back on, her heart racing. For a terrible moment, the light sputtered, dimming as if it were about to go out. She held her breath, watching the beam flicker before finally stabilizing again. She let out a shaky breath of relief, gripping it even tighter. Moving forward, Maya continued to scan the ground for footprints. The woods seemed endless, stretching out in all directions, each trail looking like it could lead to safety or deeper into the darkness. Her fear grew as she pressed on, but she reminded herself that she had to keep moving. Elijah was counting on her. Her only option was to keep going, one step at a time. After what felt like an eternity, she thought she saw a faint glow in the distance. She paused, staring at the light through the trees. It was dim, almost ghostly, and she couldn't quite make out its source, but it was there. A small, steady glow breaking through the storm. Could it be Elijah's flashlight? She strained her eyes, then called out, her voice trembling with hope. "Elijah! Elijah, it's me! Maya, are you there?" There was a pause, a stretch of silence that seemed to last forever. Then, faintly, through the wind and rain, she heard a voice calling back. "Maya!" Her heart leapt. It was Elijah. The sound of his voice filled her with a surge of relief, so strong her legs felt like they might buckle beneath her. She fought to keep steady as she pushed forward, her steps quickening as she moved toward the light. "Elijah!" she cried again, her voice filled with renewed strength. She could see him now, a faint figure crouched near the base of a tree, his hand holding a flickering flashlight. He was soaked to the bone, his face pale, and his eyes wide with disbelief as he watched her approach. "Maya, what are you doing here?" His voice was filled with shock and a mixture of relief and worry. "I came to find you," she said, her voice cracking as she finally reached him. She threw her arms around him, ignoring the rain as she hugged him tightly. "You didn't come home and I was so worried." Elijah wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, his face buried in her damp hair. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I tried to take a shortcut, but the storm got worse. I slipped and twisted my ankle." He gestured to his leg, where his foot was partially buried in the mud. "I tried calling, but my phone died and I couldn't move. I thought—" He trailed off, looking away. Maya felt a pang of guilt and relief all at once. "It's okay," she said softly, helping him shift his weight so he could lean on her. "You're safe now. We'll get home together." But as she looked around, the reality of their situation set in. The path back was even more treacherous than before. The storm was relentless, and Elijah was injured, making their journey even more difficult. She glanced down at his ankle, already swollen and bruised, and felt a wave of determination rise within her. "We'll go slow," she said firmly. "I'll help you. Just lean on me." Elijah hesitated, glancing at her doubtfully, but finally nodded. Together they began to make their way back, each step a struggle. Elijah leaned heavily on her, wincing with each movement, but they pressed on. Maya kept the flashlight aimed at the ground, scanning for obstacles, her heart pounding as she focused on each careful step. The woods seemed even darker now, every rustling leaf and snapping branch echoing ominously in the rain. They moved as one, each helping the other forward. Maya's legs felt like lead, her arms aching as she supported Elijah, but she refused to let herself falter. She thought of the stories he'd told her about brave knights and heroes who faced impossible odds, and she realized that maybe, just maybe, she could be one of them too. They stumbled along the muddy path, the light from Maya's flashlight bobbing in the darkness as she guided Elijah through the twisted trees and flooded trails. Her breaths came in gasps, her muscles aching from the weight, but she kept moving, one step at a time. "Maya, you're amazing, you know that?" Elijah murmured as they struggled forward. His voice was filled with gratitude and pride, a warmth that cut through the cold. She didn't reply, but a small smile crept onto her face, a spark of pride lighting within her. They were almost there. Just a little farther, she told herself. The sounds of the neighborhood, the faint buzz of streetlights, the distant hum of cars, grew louder, pulling her forward. Finally, as they reached the edge of the woods, the lights of their neighborhood came into view, warm and inviting against the stormy night. Maya felt a swell of relief as she spotted the glow of houses, the familiarity of the streets she had grown up on. They were almost home. They hobbled toward their house, both of them soaked, muddy, and exhausted. Neighbors were beginning to emerge from their homes, drawn out by the sight of the two siblings making their way down the street. She could hear their voices, a mix of disbelief and concern, as people recognized her and Elijah. "Maya! Elijah!" someone called out. Mrs. Ruby rushed over, her eyes wide with shock as she took in the sight of them. "Good heavens, child, what on earth happened?" Maya barely had the strength to respond, but she managed a weary smile. "We found each other," she said simply, holding Elijah's hand tightly as they finally reached the safety of their front porch. Her mother burst from the house, her face pale with worry and relief, and pulled them both into a fierce embrace. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she held them, her hands trembling as she checked them for injuries, murmuring words of comfort and gratitude. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of her family and neighbors, Maya felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had braved the storm, faced her fears, and brought her brother home. As she looked up at the faces of the people around her, she realized that they were all watching her with something close to awe. She had done something brave, something that would stay with them all long after the storm had passed. Maya leaned heavily against the doorframe, barely able to keep her eyes open. Relief and exhaustion washed over her in waves as her mother held her and Elijah close, her warm arms surrounding them like a blanket against the storm's cold. But as Maya looked around, she realized that her journey wasn't just a story for her family anymore. It was something the whole neighborhood had witnessed. Their neighbors were gathering in front of the house, drawn by the whispers that Maya had been out searching through the storm for her brother and had found him. The small crowd held a quiet reverence, murmurs of awe passing between them. Mrs. Ruby, who had seen Maya earlier in the night, looked on with a mixture of pride and disbelief. The old man from across the street, who was usually so gruff and curt, took off his hat and nodded to her in respect. Maya's mother, still holding her close, gently brushed the wet hair from her face. "You're so brave, my little girl. I can't believe you did all that. And for your brother," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Her hand trembled as it cupped Maya's cheek, and Maya saw tears glistening in her mother's eyes. "Thank you." Maya looked over at Elijah, who was leaning against the porch railing, favoring his injured ankle. Despite the pain, he smiled at her, a soft, almost proud look in his eyes. "You saved me, Maya. I don't know what I would have done without you." Hearing those words from her brother made her heart swell. Growing up, it had always been Elijah who was the protector, the one who took care of her when their mother was working long shifts or when life felt overwhelming. But tonight, she had been the one to protect him. She had taken on the storm, the dark woods, and her fears to bring him home. As their neighbors continued to gather, someone stepped forward, a local man named Mr. Williams, who was known for his sturdy, no-nonsense demeanor. He was a retired firefighter, respected in the neighborhood for his stories of bravery and survival. Maya had often heard tales about how he'd saved people from fires and other dangers, and she had always looked up to him, imagining what it would be like to be that courageous. But now, as Mr. Williams approached her, she noticed something new in his gaze: admiration. "I've seen a lot of brave souls in my life, Maya," he said, his deep voice carrying over the soft murmur of the crowd. "But I think what you did tonight tops them all. You didn't let fear stop you." Maya's cheeks warmed and she looked down, embarrassed but proud. I had to find him," she said quietly, glancing at Elijah, who gave her a small, reassuring nod. Mr. Williams turned to the crowd, raising his voice. "This young lady deserves more than just our respect. What she did out there in the storm shows the kind of courage we could all stand to learn from. Maya didn't just go out for her family, she did something that has brought all of us together." At that, The crowd broke into quiet applause, the sound hesitant at first, but growing in strength. Maya looked around, surprised to see the smiling faces of people she had known her entire life, each one gazing at her with admiration and pride. She felt a strange sense of warmth and gratitude swell inside her, and for the first time she realized how much she was a part of this community. Her mother placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, guiding her inside to dry off and rest, and Maya let herself be led inside, the warmth of the house wrapping around her like a protective cocoon. She helped Elijah settle onto the couch, propping his injured ankle on a pillow and bringing him a glass of water. As she moved through the familiar space, she felt the weight of her exhaustion begin to settle in, each muscle aching from the long night. But just as she sat down beside Elijah, there was a knock on the door. Her mother opened it to find Mrs. Ruby and Mr. Williams standing outside, holding a bundle of blankets and a thermos of hot cocoa. "Thought you all could use a little comfort after such a night," Mrs. Ruby said with a warm smile, her gaze resting on Maya with a mixture of pride and kindness. "I couldn't stop thinking about you out there, Maya, braving that storm." "Thank you," Maya murmured, taking the thermos gratefully. She poured the cocoa into mugs, sharing it with Elijah and her mother. As she sipped the warm drink, the exhaustion began to lift, replaced by a gentle sense of peace. The small act of kindness from Mrs. Ruby and Mr. Williams seemed to spark something in the other neighbors, too. One by one, people began to bring over small offerings, some cookies, a loaf of bread, a bowl of warm soup. Each person came with words of gratitude for Maya, telling her how proud they were of her bravery and selflessness. She hadn't expected any of this, she had just wanted to find her brother. But seeing how her actions had touched her community filled her with a deep sense of fulfillment. As the night wore on, the neighbors gradually drifted home, leaving the small family to rest. Maya's mother tucked a blanket around her, brushing her hair back tenderly. "You did something special tonight," she said softly. "Not just for Elijah, but for all of us. I hope you know that." Maya nodded, her eyelids growing heavy. She drifted off to sleep, her mother's words echoing in her mind, comforting her like a lullaby. In the days that followed, word of Maya's bravery spread throughout the town. People who had never noticed her before suddenly stopped to talk to her, congratulating her and asking her about her journey through the storm. She was invited to speak at the local school, where students gathered in the gym to hear her recount the story. Though she felt shy and nervous at first, she stood tall, telling them about her fear, her love for her brother, and the determination that had pushed her forward. She noticed something beautiful happening within her community. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves began reaching out to each other, inspired by the way they had come together on the night of the storm. People who had barely spoken in years found themselves reconnecting, swapping stories, and lending a hand where they could. Maya realized that her journey had been more than just a search for her brother. It had been a call to the community, a reminder that they were all connected, all responsible for one another. One afternoon, a few weeks later, Mr. Williams visited their house with a small plaque. It was hand-carved, simple but elegant, with her name etched in the wood alongside the words, "For courage and community." He handed it to her with a solemn nod, and Maya felt a surge of pride and gratitude. "This is just a little something to remind you of what you did, Maya," he said. "I hope you'll keep it close and remember that you're stronger than any storm." Maya held the plaque in her hands, running her fingers over the carved letters. She knew it was more than just a piece of wood. It was a symbol of her journey, of the love she shared with her brother, and of the bond that had grown between her and her community. As she hung the plaque on her bedroom wall, she thought back to the night of the storm, remembering each step through the rain and mud, each struggle against the wind. She had faced fears she never knew she had, discovering a strength within herself that she would carry for the rest of her life. And every time she looked at the plaque, she would remember that she wasn't alone. She had her family, her brother, and a whole community behind her, a community that would be there for her, just as she had been there for them. The days that followed the storm were marked by a renewed sense of togetherness in Maya's neighborhood. The once quiet and sometimes distant neighbors had become warmer, more connected. People who had barely waved in passing now stopped to ask how she and Elijah were doing, eager to share words of encouragement. Maya's small act of bravery seemed to echo through the streets, leaving an impact that lingered like a hopeful new beginning for everyone around her. Maya's mother was touched by the change too. She watched as neighbors brought over food, helped clear storm debris, and checked in on each other, realizing that what Maya had done had sparked something important in the people around them. She often told Maya, "What you did was more than just brave. You reminded people that we're all in this together." Maya, though touched by the praise, sometimes felt overwhelmed by all the attention. She'd been so focused on finding Elijah that night, she hadn't realized her actions could have such a lasting effect on those around her. She often found herself thinking about the people who had helped her along the way, Mrs. Ruby, who had worried about her, and even old Samuel, the kind man in the woods who had offered her warmth and encouragement. She'd been brave, but she hadn't been alone. One afternoon, as Maya was helping her mother sweep up the last of the fallen leaves and branches from their front yard, a car pulled up. Maya watched curiously as a tall woman stepped out. She was well dressed, carrying a notepad and camera, and she greeted Maya's mother with a warm smile. "Hello, Mrs. Harris," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Darlene Jenkins, a reporter from the local paper. I've heard about what your daughter did the night of the storm, and I'd love to do a story on her bravery for the community." Maya's mother glanced at her, surprise flickering across her face, and then she smiled gently. "I think that would be all right," she replied. "Maya could share what happened with you." Maya's cheeks flushed, and she looked down, feeling both nervous and excited. She hadn't expected anyone from the paper to take notice. Darlene smiled at her, sensing her shyness. "Don't worry, Maya," she said reassuringly. "Just tell me what you were thinking that night." They sat down on the porch, and as Maya started to share her story, she realized how powerful it felt to put her journey into words. She recounted every step, from her first decision to leave the house, to the cold fear of walking through the storm, to finding Elijah and helping him make it back home. Darlene listened intently, her notepad filling with details as Maya described each challenge she'd faced. "What gave you the strength to keep going?" Darlene asked, a thoughtful expression on her face as she studied Maya. Maya paused, thinking. "I just knew Elijah was out there, and he needed me. I couldn't stop until I found him. I kept thinking about all the times he had looked out for me, and it made me feel strong." Darlene nodded, smiling as she finished her notes. "You have a kind of courage most people don't find until they're much older, Maya. I think this story will remind a lot of people what it means to be brave." The story was published a few days later, and it created a wave of reactions. The headline read, "Braving the Storm, One Girl's Journey to Save Her Brother and Inspire a Community." Maya's face appeared on the front page, and as her neighbors read about her journey, her bravery continued to resonate. People across town began talking about her story, sharing it with their friends and families. At school, teachers and students alike congratulated her, their faces lighting up with admiration. Even her classmates, who had sometimes teased her for being quiet, looked at her with new respect. The story didn't just end with Maya's neighborhood either. Her story was picked up by a local radio station, and one morning, as her family sat down to breakfast, they heard her name being mentioned on the air. "She's a reminder of the power of love and courage," the host said. "In a world that sometimes feels disconnected, this young girl's determination to find her brother has brought an entire community closer." Hearing her story being shared with so many people made Maya feel both proud and a little shy. She never imagined that her decision to face the storm would touch so many lives. But as the days went by, she realized that her actions had done something even more meaningful. They had reminded people of the strength that lies in caring for each other, even when times are difficult. With the renewed connection in the community, neighbors began organizing a small event to celebrate the town's resilience during the storm. It wasn't just about Maya's story, it was about everyone who had come together to help each other in those trying days. The celebration was set for a Saturday afternoon in the town square, and Maya was invited as a guest of honor. On the day of the event, the town square was bustling with activity. People set up tables with food, others brought homemade crafts and gifts, and children played under the gentle warmth of the autumn sun. A small stage was set up at the front, decorated with ribbons and flowers, and a microphone stood waiting. Maya's heart thudded as she arrived with her mother and Elijah, unsure of what to expect. As she looked around, she recognized almost everyone from her neighborhood. Mrs. Ruby was there, waving at her from a table of baked goods, and Mr. Williams stood nearby, tipping his hat to her with a proud smile. Even old Samuel, the man who had given her shelter that night, was there, his face lit with pride as he watched her from a distance. The mayor of their town, a tall, warm-voiced woman named Mrs. Carter, took the stage and smiled at the gathered crowd. "Today, we're not just celebrating one person's bravery," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "We're celebrating what happens when a community comes together." Maya Harris reminded us all of the importance of looking out for each other. And today we thank her for reminding us of what we're capable of when we stand united. Maya's heart swelled with gratitude and pride as she listened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt a mixture of humility and joy as the people she had known all her life gathered to honor her journey and the journey they had all taken together. When Mrs. Carter called her up to the stage, Maya took a deep breath, standing slowly and making her way to the front. The crowd applauded, and as Maya stood before them, she felt her nervousness begin to melt away. She thought about what she wanted to say, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, filled with a quiet strength. "Thank you," she began, looking out over the faces of her friends, neighbors, and family. "I didn't go out that night to be brave. I went out because I love my brother, and I couldn't bear the thought of him being out there alone." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But I learned something that night. I learned that even when things seem scary, we can be strong if we have each other. I had the help of friends, neighbors, and even strangers who gave me the courage to keep going." She looked toward old Samuel, giving him a small nod, and he returned her smile, a faint tear glistening in his eye. "Maybe it was just a storm," she continued, "but I think it showed us how much we need each other. And I'm grateful to be part of a community that cares as much as all of you do." The crowd erupted into applause, and Maya felt a warmth spread through her as she stood there, surrounded by people who had become more than neighbors. They were now a family in their own way, bonded by shared experiences and a renewed commitment to each other. After the speech, Mrs. Carter handed Maya a small plaque engraved with the words, "For inspiring courage and unity in the heart of our town." Maya's hands shook slightly as she accepted it, her fingers running over the smooth, polished surface. The plaque felt weighty, but it was a good weight, a reminder of the journey she had taken, both alone and with her community. As the celebration continued, people approached Maya to congratulate her, each one sharing a kind word or a small gift. The feeling of togetherness was strong, weaving through the laughter and stories, each person connected by the strength that had carried them through that stormy night. And as Maya looked around, she knew that she would carry this memory with her for the rest of her life, a memory of courage, love, and the power of community. The celebration in the town square became a memory that would stay with Maya forever, a milestone that marked the night she found her brother, the night she found her own strength, and the day her community became like family. After the event, life slowly returned to normal, though things felt a little brighter, a little kinder. As the weeks passed, the impact of Maya's story continued to ripple through her neighborhood. Neighbors who had previously been strangers now made an effort to connect. Front doors that had once stayed closed now opened wide for each other. Neighbors shared meals, checked in with each other, and gathered for small, impromptu gatherings in each other's backyards. In an unspoken way, Maya's bravery had shown them all the importance of looking out for one another. One cold Saturday morning, as Maya and her mother were walking to the local library, they ran into Mrs. Ruby, who was on her way back from the farmer's market, carrying a basket full of fresh apples. Her face lit up when she saw them. "Maya, my dear, you've got to come over this weekend. I'm baking an apple pie and I'd love for you and your family to have a slice," Mrs. Ruby said warmly, her eyes crinkling with joy. Maya grinned. "We'd love to, Mrs. Ruby. Thank you." Her mother smiled, giving Mrs. Ruby a hug, and as they continued to the library, Maya couldn't help but feel a warmth that had little to do with the brisk autumn sun. The town felt like it had shifted in some fundamental way, and she knew that somehow her journey through the storm had been part of that change. Inside the library, Maya wandered through the aisles, browsing the rows of books. Her mind wandered to thoughts of her journey that night, the fear, the determination, and the way it had all come together to make her who she was now. She had faced something so much bigger than herself and come out the other side stronger. She hadn't just survived the storm, she had grown from it. "Maya!" a familiar voice called, breaking her thoughts. She turned to see her teacher, Mrs. Jackson, waving from across the room. Mrs. Jackson was known for her warmth and enthusiasm, and she had been one of the first to congratulate Maya after her story had made the paper. "Maya, I have an idea," Mrs. Jackson said, coming over. "Our school is holding an assembly next month, and I was wondering if you might be interested in speaking about your experience." Maya blinked, surprised. "Me? Speak at the assembly?" Mrs. Jackson nodded, smiling. "I think you have a story that could inspire a lot of students. It's not every day that someone so young does something so courageous. It might help others realize their own strength too." Maya felt a flicker of nerves but nodded slowly. "I think I'd like that," she said. She remembered how it had felt to speak in front of the crowd at the town celebration. Though it had been intimidating, she had felt the power of her words and how sharing her story had connected her to others. This would be a chance to do that again. For the next few weeks, Maya prepared for the assembly with Mrs. Jackson's help. They practiced in the empty classroom after school, going over her words, shaping the story, and building her confidence. Elijah would come by sometimes, giving her a thumbs up or offering encouragement. Though she felt nervous, she knew this was something she wanted to do. The morning of the assembly arrived, and Maya dressed carefully, choosing the outfit her mother had bought her after the storm as a reminder of her journey. She walked to school with Elijah, who squeezed her shoulder reassuringly as they approached the building. When the students filed into the assembly hall, Maya took a deep breath, waiting by the stage. She could hear the excited chatter of her classmates, the creak of chairs as they settled, and the faint murmur of teachers directing students to quiet down. Mrs. Jackson approached her, smiling warmly, and gave her a small nod of encouragement. Finally, the principal introduced her. "Today we have a very special guest. She's one of our own students, and she's here to share a story of bravery and resilience. Please welcome Maya Harris." The hall erupted into applause, and Maya stepped up to the microphone, her heart racing. She scanned the crowd, seeing the familiar faces of her classmates, some of whom she'd grown up with, some who had never known her well. She spotted Elijah near the front, giving her an encouraging smile. Gathering her courage, she began to speak. "When the storm hit our town, my brother Elijah went missing," she started, her voice steady but soft. "He'd gone out just before the rain started, and as it grew darker and the storm got stronger, I knew I had to find him. I couldn't just wait and hope he would come back on his own." Maya continued, describing the fears she'd faced, the obstacles in her way, and how each step had felt like a test of her strength. She talked about the people who had helped her, the neighbors who had worried for her, and old Samuel, whose warmth had given her a burst of courage in the darkest part of the woods. As she spoke, she noticed the room falling into a deep silence, her classmates leaning forward, their eyes wide with interest. "I learned that night that courage isn't about feeling unafraid," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "It's about doing what you know is right, even when you're scared. And when we do that, it helps others to be brave too." As she finished, the hall filled with applause, a sound that resonated in her chest and made her heart feel light. She saw faces in the crowd that seemed brighter, inspired. Some of her classmates even looked teary-eyed, moved by her words. She had spoken her truth, and in doing so, she had shared a part of herself with everyone there. After the assembly, students came up to her, each one offering words of admiration. Some told her they had never thought of courage in that way before, and others said her story had made them realize how much they loved their own siblings. A few even mentioned they'd be looking out for their friends and family a little more closely from now on. Over the following weeks, Maya's story continued to make an impact. Teachers used her journey as an example in class discussions, asking students to talk about what courage meant to them and how they could apply it in their own lives. Maya noticed small changes around her, students standing up for each other, helping one another with kindness and compassion. She saw her story in the small, subtle acts of bravery around her, like the shy student who began to speak up in class or the classmates who defended each other from teasing. Elijah was her biggest supporter through all of it. Every time he saw someone showing kindness or standing up for a friend, he would nudge Maya with a grin. "See, you're making a difference," he'd say, his voice full of pride. One day, while they were sitting together at home, Elijah turned to her with a serious expression. "You know, Maya, you've changed more than just this town. You've shown me something too." He paused, his voice softening. "I always thought I was the one who had to look out for you, But that night, you showed me how strong you are. I'm proud of you." Maya felt a warmth in her heart, realizing that her brother, her lifelong protector, had come to see her as an equal. They were partners now, bound not just by family, but by the respect and admiration they held for each other. The journey through the storm had changed them both, making them stronger together. The months slipped by, but the sense of unity in her neighborhood and school lingered. Maya often reflected on that stormy night, grateful for the courage it had drawn out of her, the strength it had helped her find. She realized that bravery wasn't just for big moments like that storm. It was a choice she could make every day. It was in the way she treated others, the kindness she showed, and the determination she carried within her. As the school year came to a close, Maya received one last surprise, a letter from the mayor inviting her to attend a community ceremony where she would be recognized with an award for courage and resilience. The award was a beautiful bronze medal engraved with her name, a symbol of the journey that had changed her life. On the day of the ceremony, Maya stood before her town once again, feeling the weight of her experiences and the love of her community. As she accepted the medal, the crowd erupted in applause, and she felt a swell of gratitude for every person who had been a part of her journey. Maya had braved a storm that night, but it was more than just wind and rain she had conquered. She had discovered a strength that would stay with her forever, a courage that could withstand any storm. And she knew that no matter what life held, she would always be ready to face it, knowing she had a community and a heart stronger than she had ever imagined. As Maya held her new medal, her fingers tracing the edges of her name, engraved in bronze, she couldn't help but think back to the cold night of the storm and the rush of fear that had pushed her forward. It felt strange, standing there with a medal that celebrated her bravery. She had never set out to be courageous. She'd simply wanted to find her brother. But somehow that determination had brought so much more into her life than she could have imagined. The mayor's ceremony left her heart brimming with pride, but it also sparked a new idea within her. She had seen firsthand how her actions had brought people together, how her journey through the storm had helped her community feel closer. She began to wonder if there was more she could do to keep that sense of connection alive. One afternoon, as she was walking with Elijah, she shared her thoughts. "I want to do something that helps people keep helping each other," she said, glancing up at him as they strolled past the neighborhood park. Elijah raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "I'm not sure yet," she admitted, kicking a pebble along the sidewalk. "But since the storm, everyone's been so much kinder, you know. I just don't want that to fade. I want everyone to keep feeling like they belong here." Elijah nodded, thoughtful. "Maybe we could start something," he suggested, his face lighting up with a spark of excitement. "A club or a group where people can come together, help each other, and share stories, kind of like what we've been doing since the storm." Maya's eyes lit up at the idea. "Yes, we could do things to help people who need it too, like if someone's house needs fixing, or if someone's going through something hard, we could be there for them." The idea felt right, as if it was exactly what she'd been searching for. With a newfound determination, Maya and Elijah began talking to neighbors and classmates, gathering anyone who wanted to be involved. They met at the local library one Saturday afternoon, where Mrs. Jackson had helped them reserve a room. Around 20 people showed up, a mix of students, neighbors, and even a few parents who had heard about Maya's idea and wanted to support it. Maya took a deep breath, feeling the familiar flutter of nerves, but she remembered her speech at the assembly and the town ceremony. She could do this. Standing at the front of the room, she looked out at the faces waiting to hear her speak. "Hi, everyone," she began, her voice steady. "Thank you all for coming. When I went out that night to find my brother, I didn't realize how much it would change things for all of us. Since then, I've felt like this community has become closer than ever, and I don't want that to end." She looked at Elijah, who nodded encouragingly. "So I thought, why don't we keep it going? Why don't we create something that helps people stay connected?" The room buzzed with excitement as Maya outlined the group's goals: to lend a helping hand to anyone in need, organize events that brought neighbors together, and create a network of people who cared for one another. They decided to call it the Unity Project, a name that felt fitting for their mission. Mrs. Ruby, sitting in the back with her hands folded in her lap, raised her hand. "I think this is a wonderful idea, Maya. You're inspiring people just by being you." Her voice was warm, and the compliment made Maya smile, a new sense of confidence filling her chest. The Unity Project took off faster than Maya could have imagined. The group organized small activities around the neighborhood, starting with simple things like cleaning up the park and collecting donations for families in need. They set up a bulletin board in the library where people could post if they needed help or wanted to volunteer. Soon, people began turning to them whenever they needed support or simply wanted to get to know their neighbors. One weekend, they decided to help Mr. Williams with some repairs around his house. As a retired firefighter, he'd spent his life helping others, but his own house had fallen into a bit of disrepair. Volunteers from the Unity Project showed up with tools, paint and supplies, working together to fix his broken fence, repaint his porch, and tidy up his yard. Even Elijah pitched in, painting the porch rails and joking around with Mr. Williams, who was delighted by the help and the company. By the time they finished, the house looked brighter and more welcoming, and Mr. Williams couldn't stop smiling. "This is the best my house has looked in years," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "I always told myself I'd get around to it, but I'm not as spry as I used to be. I can't thank you enough." The Unity Project wasn't just about big projects either. People came together for smaller acts of kindness, like delivering groceries to elderly neighbors or organizing monthly potluck dinners at the town square. Each time they gathered, Maya felt a stronger bond with the people around her, and she saw how these simple acts of support made everyone feel more connected, more like family. As the months passed, Maya began to notice how the ripple effects of the Unity Project were changing lives. At school, students were quicker to lend a hand or offer encouragement. Teachers spoke proudly of Maya's initiative, mentioning the Unity Project in their lessons as an example of community responsibility. Even shy students who might have felt invisible before were finding ways to get involved. One day, Maya received a handwritten letter from old Samuel. He had been one of the first people she'd thought of when the Unity Project began, and she had made sure he was included in every gathering, every event, even though he lived on the edge of town. In his letter, he thanked her for the warmth she had shown him and for making him feel like part of something. "For years, I thought nobody cared whether I was around or not," he wrote. "You've shown me otherwise, Maya. I haven't felt this much hope in a long time." Reading his words, Maya felt a surge of joy and gratitude. The Unity Project was more than a club or an after-school activity. It was becoming a source of hope and comfort for people who had felt alone or disconnected. And though it had started with her journey through the storm, it was now growing into something larger, something that could endure far beyond a single night of bravery. One crisp autumn evening, as the Unity Project gathered for a small bonfire in the town square, Maya sat back, listening to the laughter and conversation around her. Families mingled, children chased each other around the glowing fire, and a feeling of warmth filled the cool night air. Elijah was there, laughing with some friends, and even her mother had come, sharing stories with Mrs. Ruby and Mr. Williams. As the fire crackled, Mrs. Jackson joined Maya, sitting beside her on the bench. She looked around the scene, a proud smile on her face. "You know, Maya, what you've done here is something special. It's not often that one person can bring a whole community together like this." Maya looked down, a bit embarrassed, but she couldn't help but smile. "I didn't do it alone," she said. Everyone helped. They wanted to come together, they just needed a reason. Mrs. Jackson nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes all it takes is one person to light the way. You faced the storm, Maya, but what you did afterward, well, that's the real journey, isn't it?" Maya thought about her teacher's words as she watched the fire, the glow of the flames flickering against the faces around her. She realized that the storm had been the beginning, a catalyst that had revealed the strength she had always had within her. But it was the work she had done afterward, the community she had helped build, that had created a lasting legacy. As the evening wore on, Maya looked around, feeling a deep sense of peace. Her brother, her mother, her neighbors, they were all here, part of something bigger than themselves, something she knew would last. And as she sat by the fire, she knew that no matter what storms life brought her way, she would always have the strength to face them and the people she loved to see her through. The fire began to die down, the evening drawing to a close, but the spirit of unity lingered in the air, a reminder of the power of courage, kindness, and community. And as Maya and her family walked home under the blanket of stars, she felt ready for whatever might come next, her heart steady, her steps sure, and her spirit as unbreakable as ever. In the weeks after the autumn bonfire, the Unity Project continued to grow, transforming the neighborhood into a place where everyone looked out for each other. Maya could feel a real sense of belonging and warmth, even as the first hints of winter crept into the air. People were there for each other in ways that felt deeper than before, and for the first time, Maya sensed that she was part of something strong, something unshakable. One chilly Saturday morning, Maya and Elijah were walking through town, carrying supplies for a Unity Project food drive they had organized at the community center. Their arms were full of canned goods and blankets that the neighborhood had donated. They'd expected some help, but the sheer amount of items collected amazed them both. As they walked, a familiar voice called out, "Good morning, Maya. Elijah." It was Mrs. Ruby, standing in front of her small bakery, with a smile as warm as the scent of freshly baked bread that filled the air. She waved them over, holding out 2 paper bags. "I packed a couple of breakfast rolls for you too," she said, handing over the bags. "Figured you'd need the energy with all that you're doing." Maya thanked her, her heart swelling with gratitude as she took a bite of the warm roll. She and Elijah exchanged smiles, savoring the simple joy of being a part of such a close, caring community. As they continued toward the community center, Maya looked around, noticing how much the neighborhood had changed since that stormy night. There were people chatting on their porches, neighbors helping each other shovel leaves, children playing together, all small signs of connection and support that filled her with pride. At the community center, they met with other members of the Unity Project who had volunteered to help set up for the drive. Among them were familiar faces, Mr. Williams, who had become a steady volunteer, old Samuel, who showed up whenever he could, and even a few teachers and classmates from school. It felt like the entire town had turned out to support the project, eager to help others during the colder months ahead. As they organized the donations into neat piles, Maya felt a hand on her shoulder. Turning, she saw Mr. Williams, his eyes twinkling, with a look of pride. "You're doing something special, Maya," he said softly. "You know, I've lived in this neighborhood for decades, and I've never seen folks come together like this. You've made a real difference." Maya smiled up at him, her cheeks warming. "Thank you, Mr. Williams. But it's really all of us together. I just wanted us to feel like a family." He nodded, tipping his hat. "Well, you've certainly managed that." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes it just takes one person to light a spark, and you did that for us." Maya carried his words with her throughout the day as she and the other volunteers sorted food, packed boxes, and set up tables. Every now and then, people from the town would stop by with even more donations: extra blankets, bags of rice, cans of soup, and warm clothing. By the time the food drive began, they had enough supplies to fill dozens of boxes, each one brimming with essentials for families in need. As they handed out the boxes, Maya felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Each box carried more than food or supplies. It was a symbol of care and compassion, a reminder that they were all connected. Families expressed their gratitude with smiles, hugs, and even a few tears, and Maya felt her heart expand, realizing that she had helped create something that could carry people through the hardships of winter. As the food drive wound down and the last of the boxes were distributed, Maya spotted a familiar face, a young girl named Tessa, who was new to the neighborhood. Maya had noticed her around school, quiet and often alone, looking lost in the hallways. She waved Tessa over, offering her a seat beside her. "Hi, Tessa," Maya said, giving her a friendly smile. "How are you?" Tessa hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty, but after a moment she returned Maya's smile. "I'm good, thank you," she said softly, glancing at the busy community center around them. "I heard about the food drive and wanted to help, but I didn't know if I should come." "We're glad you did," Maya replied warmly. "There's always room for more people in the Unity Project. You're welcome to join us any time." Tessa's face brightened, her shyness melting away just a bit. "I'd like that," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I've been wanting to make friends, but it's been hard. Moving to a new place is scary." Maya nodded, understanding instantly. "I felt the same way once, but you know what I learned? When you help others, you feel connected, like you belong. And it's easier to make friends because everyone's working toward the same thing." As the two girls talked, Maya felt a sense of joy at reaching out to Tessa, knowing that a simple act of kindness could make a difference. She invited Tessa to their next Unity Project meeting, promising her a warm welcome. Tessa's face lit up with gratitude, and Maya felt as though she'd made a friend. Over the next few weeks, Tessa joined the Unity Project wholeheartedly. She came to every meeting, eager to help, and Maya noticed how her confidence blossomed with each activity. The Unity Project became a place for Tessa to find her own strength, and Maya watched with pride as her new friend began to shine. As winter settled over the town, the Unity Project took on new challenges. They organized coat drives, helped shovel sidewalks for elderly neighbors, and even went caroling together to lift people's spirits. Each act of kindness brought the community closer, strengthening the bonds Maya had dreamed of fostering. The Unity Project became more than a group. It became a source of comfort and strength that everyone in town could rely on. One evening, after another successful meeting, Elijah walked Maya home under the bright winter stars. The air was cold, their breath visible in the moonlight, but neither of them felt the chill. "You know," Elijah said thoughtfully, glancing at Maya, "I never realized how much of a difference one person could make. You didn't just help people, Maya, you showed us what it means to care about each other." Maya looked up at her brother, her heart swelling with pride. "I didn't do it alone. It was everyone, working together. I just wanted us to be closer." "And you did that," Elijah said, his voice warm. "You brought people together in a way that will last, no matter what storms come next." As they walked, Maya thought about the journey she had taken, from that stormy night when she set out to find Elijah to this winter evening, surrounded by a community transformed. She had discovered so much about herself and her neighbors, realizing that strength could be found in the simplest acts of kindness and connection. They reached their house, and as they climbed the steps, Maya paused, looking out over the quiet, snow-dusted streets of her neighborhood. The lights from each house seemed to shine a little brighter, like stars of their own, illuminating the strength and unity they had all built together. In the days leading up to Christmas, Maya and the Unity Project planned one final gathering for the year, a holiday feast open to the whole community, a celebration of the friendships and connections they had made. They decorated the town square with lights, wreaths, and a towering Christmas tree adorned with ornaments donated by neighbors. Tables were set up with food, laughter, and cheer, filling the air as families gathered to share a meal together. Maya looked around the town square, feeling a deep sense of peace as she watched everyone come together. Mrs. Ruby was serving hot cider, Mr. Williams was sharing stories with a group of kids, and Tessa was laughing with new friends, her face glowing with happiness. Even old Samuel was there, sitting by the fire, a contented smile on his face. As Maya moved through the crowd, people stopped to thank her, to tell her how much she had changed their lives. Each word of gratitude warmed her heart, filling her with a sense of fulfillment she couldn't quite put into words. She had set out that night in the storm to find her brother, but she had found so much more, a community, a sense of purpose, and a belief in the power of love and resilience. At the end of the evening, Maya stood beside the Christmas tree, gazing up at its twinkling lights. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Elijah, his face filled with pride. "You did it, Maya," he whispered. "You made this happen." Maya looked around, taking in the joyful faces of her family, friends and neighbors, each one a reminder of the journey they had all taken together. She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek, and smiled. "Maybe," she said softly, "but we all did it together." As the holiday feast came to a close and the town square slowly emptied, Maya found herself lingering by the glowing Christmas tree, the warmth of the gathering still filling her heart. The twinkling lights danced softly across the square, casting a cozy glow on the quiet town. She was joined by her mother, who slipped an arm around her shoulders, holding her close. "I'm so proud of you, Maya," her mother whispered. "You've done something remarkable here. You brought everyone together and helped create something that will last." Maya looked up, feeling the familiar warmth of her mother's embrace. "I never expected any of this. I just wanted to find Elijah that night. I just didn't want to be alone." Her mother smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair from Maya's face. "Sometimes the simplest intentions can lead to the greatest changes. You've shown people what it means to be there for each other, to be part of something bigger than themselves." They stood together for a moment in comfortable silence, watching as the last families waved goodbye and headed home. Mr. Williams nodded to Maya one last time, his smile warm and proud, while Tessa and her family gave her an enthusiastic wave, a glow of gratitude lighting their faces. Elijah joined them by the tree, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "This has been one of the best years, thanks to you, Maya," he said, his voice soft but filled with sincerity. "I don't know if you realize how much you've given all of us." Maya's heart swelled, and she smiled at her brother. "I guess. I just wanted everyone to feel connected, like I do now, like we're all family." She took a deep breath, gazing up at the star on top of the tree. "I think we've done that." Elijah chuckled, nudging her shoulder. "You did more than just connect people. You built a community." The three of them started walking home under the blanket of stars, the chill of winter softened by the warmth they shared. As they strolled down the quiet streets, Maya looked back at the town square, the Christmas lights shimmering like a promise that no matter what storms came, they would face them together. When they arrived home, Maya took one last look out the window, her heart brimming with gratitude and peace. She knew the year ahead would bring new challenges, but she felt ready to face them, surrounded by a community that had become family. She closed her eyes, remembering that night in the storm when she had set out to find Elijah. She realized now that the journey had been about more than just finding her brother. It had been about finding herself and the strength she carried within her all along. With that thought, Maya drifted off to sleep, her dreams filled with the familiar faces of those she'd come to know, trust, and love. She knew that whatever the future held, she would always have a place in the heart of her community, and they would always be there for each other, like stars shining brightly through the darkest night.